All right, Mr. Little here, just bringing y'all another quick video. I did ultimately decide to make one on biology, cognition, and learning. And this is a particularly fascinating unit to me, and I'm a little almost annoyed by the fact that so many really, really fascinating topics are put into one module here, and we can't really expand upon them as deeply and as thoroughly as I would like. But nevertheless, to kind of summarize this entire unit in one sentence, that sentence would probably be it's not quite that simple. When we looked at operant conditioning, when we looked at classical conditioning, those were very much these like behaviorist views of learning that said we're purely products of our environment and anyone can learn anything just by associations they make, whether they're automatic in classical conditioning or they're through rewards or reinforcers or punishers in operant conditioning. The overarching theme of this chapter is that biology matters. Okay, we do have some predispositions, kind of from a survivalistic point of view, that wire us to learn some things more easily than other things, and that's this idea of preparedness. And the chart that kind of outlines this is right here. Looking at we also have different biological factors that influence what we're able to learn, psychological factors, and culture is very important as well. And one of the kind of leaders of this school of thought that biology does, in fact, matter, we're predisposed to learn some things more than others, is John Garcia. And I also want to note that John Garcia is the first Latinx psychology research we've came across. He has a fascinating backstory. He came from an immigrant family and forged his way into this field that at the time was very, very much dominated by white males. And I encourage you to look up more into his story. But what John Garcia discovered was this idea of taste aversion. We talked about Pavlov's classical conditioning study and the basic principles of classical conditioning, and a behaviorist theory towards that was that you could condition anyone to have any response to any stimulus at an equal strength. Garcia found this is not the case. We're way more likely to have stronger and longer lasting conditioned responses to the stimulus of food, particularly food that makes us sick. So if you ever have like a bad batch of oysters or something like that and you're throwing up the next day, you're going to have a much stronger conditioned response to those oysters than you would other stimulus. And a really cool application of Garcia's findings what was shown in kind of a case study on shepherds and how they kept wolves away from their sheep. There was a group of shepherds who had a huge problem with their sheeps being taken out by wolves. And so they lathered the sheep's fur in this poison that would make the wolves have a really, really nauseating response and get sick, and found that the wolves actually learned to associate these sheep with this horrible, sickening taste, and then in turn started to avoid them. And another element that kind of challenges these traditional behaviorist views on learning is findings of instinctive drift. Instinctive drift basically explains how, although we can teach and condition animals to do a lot of different things, they're going to be way easier to condition to do things that go along the lines of their natural tendencies. So like a horse is very, very easy to train to go through a certain obstacle course because they're kind of predisposed to be athletic, run, jump, and be agile. But they also found in a study, and this is just a straight up cruel study, but nevertheless, some researchers trained pigs to take coins and put them in a piggy bank through operant conditioning, rewarding them for that behavior. But over time, after they had trained pigs to do this, they started to find that pigs would lose interest in it and just wanted to go back to their normal behaviors. So it's regardless of how we train animals, they're going to tend to, or even people, we're going to tend to go back to our natural instincts. And that kind of goes against this idea of behaviorism. We've actually already looked at one element of latent learning, which is insight learning in our first week, or that kind of sudden aha moment. But when we're talking about latent learning, we're talking about learning that occurs out of necessity. And another example of this is in the most cliche psychology study that has ever been invented, where researchers had a mouse in a maze and a block of cheese outside of the maze. And this was Tolman's research, by the way. They found that mice were able to actually navigate or create a cognitive map of that maze, which is a mental representation of the layout, and continually find the cheese outside of the maze. But the note here, the important takeaway is this was latent learning, or an example of latent learning, because it was driven out of necessity. The mice had the necessity to escape the maze and find their reward of cheese. So that takes us to actually another idea you've already came across when looking at creativity, which is intrinsic motivation. But we didn't go into too much depth there, and we didn't really relate it to the antithesis of it, which is extrinsic motivation. So if we remember, intrinsic motivation is wanting to do something just because we want to, because we enjoy it. You might play an instrument just for fun. You might play video games just for fun because you enjoy it. I like to go and play pickup basketball because I like to do that. So anything we do for the sake of enjoyment is something we're intrinsically motivated to do. And then anything we do for an incentive or for a reward is extrinsic motivation. And this is one of those things, I wish I could teach an entire class on this. I'm more interested in this than just about anything. But an interesting finding related to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is you can actually kind of squash creativity and the desire to do something if you begin taking something someone's already intrinsically motivated to do and then rewarding them for it, giving them money or giving them some kind of extrinsic incentive. So for example, it's been shown that musicians will actually enjoy playing music less if you start paying them to do that. And my hope for this class is that I'm in some way able to keep you all intrinsically motivated to learn this material, even though we have this extrinsic motivation of passing our AP exam. And your book also talks about different coping strategies that we learn to deal with situations in this chapter. I know this chapter is a little all over the place, but it breaks these two strategies down into problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. And problem-focused coping is when we feel like we have control over a situation, and we have a problem and we try to address that problem by changing the problem. So if you and your significant other are having relationship issues, a problem-focused coping strategy would be to address those head on, have a conversation, see if you can resolve the issues. Emotion-focused coping is when we feel like we don't have control over a situation and we're not able to change our circumstances. So an example of this might be right now. We're in the middle of this pandemic. We're not sure what we can do about it or how we can change those circumstances. But an emotion-focused coping strategies kind of is a way to, rather than try to change the problem, to kind of get away from the problem. You might ignore it, but you'll definitely instead attend to your emotional needs. So you might confide in your friends to help cope with this issue. You might start exercising or picking up a hobby to kind of distract yourself from those issues. And these coping strategies are pretty closely tied to our locus of control. And this is another thing that I wish we could expand on a lot further, and I wish it wasn't just kind of one of many topics on this module. But there's some really fascinating research on this stuff. But an internal locus of control is an idea that we have control over our own destiny, that we have the power to change our circumstances, and we can be kind of self-driven. An external locus of control is the idea that we don't have control of our own destiny. We're just gonna everything that happens to us is just gonna be a result of our environments. And I want to make something clear here. So your book talks about, and there is a lot of research to back that this mindset, an internal locus of control, is very beneficial in future success and outcomes academically and in the work world, versus an external locus of control. But this stuff should never be taken to say, or these findings should never be taken to say that circumstances don't matter, because they do. There's so much research out there to show how much of an impact things like sexism, institutional racism, and things like that play into things. So this is just referring to that mindset. This isn't by any means supposed to be taken in a way that says circumstances don't matter. And then the final idea your book gets at here is learned helplessness, and the kind of founder of learned helplessness was a guy by the name of Seligman. And Seligman, through this study on a dog, I'm not going to go into too much detail in the study, but he set a dog up where no matter what decision it made, it would be punished for it. It would receive a shock, and found that even when it then gave the dog an opportunity to avoid that situation, the dog would still just kind of curl up and do nothing, because it had learned that nothing it does to pull himself out of its situation works. But the formula for learned helplessness, and something you'll want to know if you come across a question like this, is that if we have uncontrollable bad events, if we're constantly faced with some kind of misfortune that we feel like we can't do anything about, we don't have any control over, and we perceive that lack of control, we believe we don't have any control, we're going to disengage. We're going to exhibit some helpless behavior and not even make an attempt to get out of whatever that situation is. And I think we're going to go more into this on in our class on Thursday. I'm trying to work on getting some discussion questions we can engage with, but for now I'll leave it at that explanation in this video, and I do want to wrap this up. But thank you all for watching, and we will see you in class tomorrow.